Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Creation Myths. I am really excited for this one because what we are going to talk about today is how Dr. Rob Carter from Creation Ministries International, professional young earth creationist with a legit PhD, Dr. Rob Carter, recently admitted, whether he realizes it or not, recently admitted that all of the creationist calculations around the dating of Mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosome Adam are wrong. And we're going to talk about it. So this is the result of an appearance that Dr. Carter made on the Logos Research Associates YouTube channel on January 8th, 2025. This was kind of a long interview, and then he did kind of a Q&A with the audience through the chat. And I'm going to show you several clips of this appearance. I'm going to show you kind of a longer clip that sets the context, and then we'll jump in and we'll talk about it, because it's right at the end of this first clip that he says the really important thing. So first, let's take a look, then we'll come back to the important part. So take a listen to this.
If you're going to take a human, if you're going to take a human chimpanzee common ancestor and split into humans and chimpanzees, you have to have tens of thousands of genomic rearrangements. You have to move genes around. You have to change the coordination of entire genetic pathways. That is extremely difficult, and we would expect that almost all those changes are going to be detrimental to the organism. A paper came out in Science just last week, Inherited Genome Instability. And they're talking about one particular class of segmental variations, which is a copy number variation if you like, that causes childhood cancers. Yeah, you can't just change DNA. You can't move everything around at random. There's a lot of bad stuff that can happen. The genome is not infinitely mutable. So if you want to cause that many mutations, which is the number of differences between us times many thousands, because most of them will be lost over time, you're talking about a very large mutation burden.
Did you catch that right at the end? I'm going to play it for you again. Here it is.
So if you want to cause that many mutations, which is the number of differences between us times many thousands, because most of them will be lost over time.
And one more time, just so we're clear on what the important words are here. One more time.
Number of differences between us times many thousands, because most of them will be lost over time.
Dr. Carter said right there, you just heard him, quote, because most of them will be lost over time, referring to mutations that occur within humans. Now, this is a problem for young earth creationists because it's in direct contradiction with their calculations for the mitochondrial and Y-chromosome most recent common ancestors. The person responsible for those calculations is Dr. Nathaniel Jeansons from Answers in Genesis. Very famously, this is like his thing. Now, when I spoke to Dr. Jeanson about this a couple of years ago, he said something that confirmed something I had been saying about his work for years that other creationists had been disputing. But he said to me, finally acknowledging and clearing the argument once and for all, that he's using the mutation rate, the rate at which mutations occur, as the substitution rate, the rate at which mutations accumulate within genomes. Here, you can watch that clip right here where he says it.
So we've got my claim from the examination of the published literature that the mutation rate is 3 mutations per generation, and I'm treating the mutation rate as a substitution rate, that this rate is consistent.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's what I'm doing.
This matters because this is in direct contradiction to what Dr. Carter just said, because he just said that most mutations are lost over time. And Jeanson is saying, no, every mutation that occurs forms a new lineage and sticks in that lineage, right? It's a one-to-one. Mutation occurs, and now it's there, and we can identify it. Not mutation occurs, and then some fraction of them are lost over time. And importantly, what Dr. Jeanson said must be the case in order to get the young earth calculations to work for the time to most recent common ancestor, for example, the mitochondrial DNA or the Y-chromosome. If you allow the substitution rate to deviate even just a little bit from the mutation rate, the young earth calculations no longer work. So what Dr. Rob Carter just said confirms what I and lots of other people have been saying about the young Earth model when it comes to the timing of mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosome Adam. And that's that the math doesn't work because you're ignoring this very basic facet of population genetics. Now, it's possible, maybe Dr. Carter didn't mean what he said, or maybe I'm misinterpreting what he said, but conveniently, during the Q&A, somebody asked him about this. And funny enough, it was actually friend of the channel, Ian Chen, actually asked a question, and the host, it was the last question that the host brought up from the audience to Dr. Carter. And a really funny thing happened where the host read the question and Dr. Carter said, "Oh, I bet I know who that was," thinking it was going to be me, and then it was Ian instead. And I just want to appreciate that the people watching this show, not just me, but also Ian and a couple other people that were there in the live chat, caught what Rob Carter said that I just showed you and its implications. So Ian asked about this directly, and I'm going to show you Dr. Carter's response. It's a bit long, it's a bit convoluted, but I'm going to show it to you because then we can parse it and we can see how what he says confirms what we just talked about, that what he is saying contradicts what Jeanson has been saying. So take a look at this clip.
The last question, can't tell if it's just wanting clarification or surprised that you said something. Said, did Dr. Carter just admit substitution rate is different from mutation rate?
I'm gonna guess who asked that. Oh no, not the person I thought asked that. Okay, this brings up a very interesting thing. In standard population genetics, if you have a well-mixed population, and it actually even doesn't matter the size, the mutation rate over time will approximate the substitution rate. That's you combine two population genetics formulas and you get that. So whatever the mutation rate is, that will be the long-term substitution rate. And that's one of the reasons why the evolutionist has a way of explaining in 6.5 million years humans and chimpanzee differences, at least a lot of them. The problem with that is, I said, well, mixed population. We know the human population today is stratified. We know that in the past it's been stratified. Random mating is pretty much a really bad assumption. That's not human behavior and doesn't fit geography either. But there's something else very interesting. The human race has not evolved in 10,000 evolutionary years. Zero evolution. Why? Because we've been going through an exponential growth spurt in the evolutionary model since the dawn of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, and in exponentially growing populations, you get no fixation. That's the substitution rate. In other words, a mutation arises in some farmer in India, and that has to spread throughout the entire human race. So every single person now has 2 copies of that mutation. It has been fixed. The original thing was lost. That's required for a species to evolve. But humans have not evolved since we started expanding. And also, the substitution rate the fixation rate will slow to a crawl in very large populations. If a mutation occurs, it would take a fantastically long time to spread throughout the entire population. Now, given maybe 8 billion people, and everyone has about 100 new mutations, we'd expect the fixation rate to be about 100 per generation, but we have an exponentially growing population, so the fixation rate is 0, and has been for a long time. So, in other words, whatever your population model is, you can simplify it by assuming random mating and assuming a lot of things. Or you can realize that throughout human history and chimpanzee history, lots of changes in population size and stratification and separation have occurred. So the number isn't nearly as easy to come by as a simple formula might indicate. How's that?
So let's go through this line by line, sentence by sentence, because I want to make sure we're all clear on what Rob Carter just said. So let's take it a little bit at a time, and we're going to go through it. This brings up a very interesting thing in standard population genetics. If you have a well-mixed population, and it actually doesn't matter the size, the mutation rate over time will approximate the substitution rate. You combine 2 population genetics formulas, and you get that, so whatever the mutation rate is, that will be the long-term substitution rate. And that's one of the reasons why the evolutionist has a way of explaining in 6.5 million years humans and chimpanzee differences, at least a lot of them. All right, so I just want to stop there. Good enough for our purposes. Basically, what he's saying is that if you only have drift, genetic drift, operating on a population, then the mutation rate and the substitution rate will be approximately equal. Right? That's what he's saying. If you have no other evolutionary mechanisms, like, for example, inbreeding or other forms of non-random mating or natural selection, right? If you just have genetic drift, then the mutation rate and the substitution rate will be approximately equal. He continues, the problem is that I said well-mixed population. We know the human population today is stratified. We know that in the past it's been stratified. Random mating is pretty much a really bad assumption. That's not human behavior and doesn't fit geography either. But there is something very interesting. The human race has not evolved in 10,000 evolutionary years, zero evolution. Why? Because we've been going through an exponential growth spurt in the evolutionary model since the dawn of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, and in exponentially growing populations, you get no fixation. So I have some quibbles with this, the 10,000 evolutionary years thing. Agriculture is a little bit older than 10,000 years, but he's right that random mating is not occurring, and there's geographical variations and like mating patterns and things, so an allele that's over here won't necessarily spread over there efficiently through the human population. There's some weird stuff in that little bit that I just went through, but he's got the big picture right in terms of what matters for what we're talking about. So let's continue. In other words, a mutation arises in some farmer in India, and that has to spread through the entire human race. So every single person now has 2 copies of that mutation. It has been fixed, and the original thing was lost. That's required for a species to evolve. But humans have not evolved since we started expanding, and also the substitution rate or the fixation rate will slow to a crawl in very large populations. Now, first, let's just talk about some things that are wrong here. Okay, we can document that humans are evolving. We can look, for example, at some very recent alleles that have greatly increased in frequency in specific populations, such as, for example, the mutations associated with blood oxygen saturation in Tibetan populations, or the prevalence of the sickle cell allele in sub-Saharan African populations. These are relatively recent examples of humans evolving, right? Of changes in the allele frequencies in human populations. But the big thing that's going on here is he's saying that as we have a bigger population, the fixation rate will slow to a crawl. And the reason that this happens, if you dig into the population genetics, is that genetic drift plays a much smaller role in very large populations. Now, what he's not saying is that the reason for that is that natural selection is able to operate more efficiently in very large populations. And natural selection will affect the substitution rate. Natural selection will cause a divergence between the mutation rate and the substitution rate, because the net effect of natural selection is to weed out the most harmful alleles from the population. That's kind of the unsaid thing that is behind those couple sentences we just went through. Continuing on, if a mutation occurs, it would take a fantastically long time to spread throughout the entire population now, given maybe 8 billion people, and everyone has about 100 new mutations. We'd expect the fixation rate to be about 100 per generation, but we have an exponentially growing population, so the fixation rate is 0 and has been for a long time. This is kind of the key right here, because right there, he totally gives up the game. He said there's about 100 new mutations per person, per generation, and also the fixation rate is 0. That means the mutation rate and the substitution rate are 2 different numbers. He said it crystal clear. He gave, here's one number, here's another number. They are different numbers. Importantly, this is also the case within the biblical time frame, because he's talking about a large exponentially growing population. Have you ever seen the graphs of population growth that creationists use since the Ark? It's an exponentially growing population. So even according to them, based on what Dr. Carter just said, the mutation rate cannot equal the substitution rate. What Dr. Carter just said, what we just went through, is 180 degrees from what Dr. Jeanson says. These two things are completely incompatible. And when it comes to the population genetics, Dr. Rob Carter is a lot closer to the mark than Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. So let's finish with what Dr. Carter said here. He says, so in other words, whatever your population model is, you can simplify it by assuming random mating and assuming a lot of things, or you can realize that throughout human history and chimpanzee history, lots of changes in population size and stratification and separation have occurred, so the number isn't nearly as easy to come by as a simple formula might indicate. And then he finished by asking, how's that? And my answer is, Dr. Carter, that was pretty great, because you just said what I've been saying for a long time, which is that the mutation rate does not equal the substitution rate. And because that is the case, and you finally agree that that is the case, because we now all agree that the mutation rate and the substitution rate are not equal to each other, and you just went through the numbers, right? 100 mutations per generation, 0 substitutions. You just provided those numbers. Those numbers are incompatible with the young Earth timeline. So now I would hope that we agree that Dr. Jeanson's time to most recent common ancestor calculations are wrong. And if those calculations are wrong, then we must agree that the young Earth timeline is impossible given human genetics. Basic population genetics, as you, Dr. Carter, just described. So that's it. Debate over, right, everybody? As you can see, according to what Dr. Carter said on January 8th, 2025, that's the ball game. He agrees that the mutation rate and the substitution rate in humans are not equal. Therefore, the debate over the creationist calculations from Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson regarding the time to most recent common ancestor for Mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosome Adam, the young Earth calculations are wrong. I've been saying it for years. The mutation rate doesn't equal the substitution rate. That's the ballgame. Dr. Carter, you heard him. We went through it line by line. He said the mutation rate doesn't equal the substitution rate. That's it. The creationists are wrong. I hope that in addition to Dr. Carter, more professional young Earth creationists will come around to admitting what is clearly true based on the most basic population genetics. Thank you everybody for watching. Please remember to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe if you're here and you're not already subscribed. Welcome. And please share this video around. I'm really excited for this one. It's not every day that a professional creationist basically admits that the thing I've been saying for years is actually correct, but that's what we just saw happen here. And one more thing, if you are so inclined, please consider becoming a channel member. Members get immediate access to pre-recorded videos like this instead of having to wait for the public releases. So thank you all again for watching, and as always, don't get fooled.